You don't really believe your own child will turn on you. Not after labor pains. Not after birthday cakes and late-night doctor visits, and all the times you said, "Take mine, I'll eat later." You raise them. You love them. You let parts of yourself die so they can live fuller. And then one day, they look at you like a burden they can no longer carry. It didn't happen in a storm of shouting. It wasn't dramatic. That's the part that haunts me the most. She stood by the door with her arms crossed like a landlord tired of excuses. My toothbrush was already packed. So were my shoes. No tears, no hug. Just a flat tone that said, "Mom, I think it's best if you go." I had $7 in my purse, not even enough for a hot meal and a safe ride. But I left anyway. And if you had told me then, cold, hungry, sitting on a metal bench with blisters in my shoes, that the same woman who walked away with $7 to her name would soon be holding an $800,000 check with tears of gratitude on her face, I would have laughed in your face. Not because I didn't believe in miracles, but because I didn't believe I was still allowed to have one. This is the story of how I lost everything and found myself in the process. Not in a mansion, not with revenge, but with quiet strength and the kind of peace no money can buy. Let me tell you how it all happened. If you've ever had someone turn on you, this story is for you. Before we continue, please subscribe. She stood by the doorway like a landlord waiting for a tenant to vacate. There was no tremble in her voice, no flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Just calm finality. She'd made up her mind long before I entered the room. "Mom, I think it's best if you find somewhere else to stay," she said, like she was offering me a helpful suggestion, not breaking my heart. At first, I thought she was tired. Maybe something had upset her. I asked if everything was all right, and she responded with that clipped, neutral tone people use when they've trained themselves not to feel anything. "It's nothing personal. I just need space." But it was personal. It was deeply personal. This was the same girl who once clung to my neck during thunderstorms. The one I'd stayed up with when she was sick, missing sleep to make sure she kept breathing through the night. I gave her my youth, my money, my back, my prayers. And now, with the same mouth that used to call me mommy through tears, she was asking me to leave like I was an old coat taking up space in her closet. I stood there in the middle of her living room, the same one I helped decorate when she moved in, looking at her like I didn't recognize her anymore. Or maybe I was finally seeing her for who she'd become. Either way, the air shifted between us. A wall had risen, and I was on the outside. I tried to speak, but nothing came. The lump in my throat sat there like a stone. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of disappointment. She didn't meet my eyes. She looked past me, through me. Like I was a stranger whose presence made her uncomfortable, my suitcase was already by the door. She had packed it neatly. One coat, a few clothes, my Bible, some toiletries. Everything folded so precisely, it felt less like care and more like logistics. Like a hotel checkout, not a farewell. She walked into the kitchen while I stood frozen, pretending to busy herself with something in the sink. She didn't look back. Not once. And I didn't ask her to. I picked up the suitcase and walked out. There are moments in life when you feel the exact second a bond breaks. Not with noise, not with drama, but with stillness. Like glass cracking beneath your feet, so thin you almost miss it. That was the day I realized love can grow cold in silence. That even the people you sacrificed everything for can forget what it cost you. That was the day my daughter looked through me as if I were nothing. And I never forgot how that felt. She didn't look me in the eyes when she handed me the money. Just held it out between us like it was enough to settle something. $7. Folded in half, handed off quickly, like an afterthought. I took it without speaking. Not because I agreed with what was happening, but because there was nothing left to say. That was the last exchange between a mother and the daughter she once gave everything for. I stepped outside, suitcase in one hand, my fingers clenched around the bills in the other. There was no driver waiting, no taxi idling by the curb, just the wide, open street stretching out ahead of me. Maybe she'd called someone, and they never showed. Or maybe she never planned to send me off with more than she thought was convenient. Either way, I walked. Each step away from her house felt like a betrayal I hadn't prepared for. Not because of the distance, but because of what I was walking away from. Memories we made, sacrifices she forgot, years of giving that ended with 7 silent dollars and a shut door. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to keep moving. Pride wouldn't let me knock on a neighbor's door. Fear wouldn't let me sit on the curb and cry. So I walked with stiff legs and a lump in my throat, my suitcase wheels clicking against the pavement like a metronome counting down everything I had left. There was no goodbye, not a wave from the window, not a call to check in after I left. Just silence, the kind that follows you, the kind that doesn't echo, because it already swallowed the sound. I ended up near a gas station, not because I needed anything, but because it was well lit and made me feel less alone. I sat on the edge of the sidewalk and opened my purse to look at the money again. $7. Not enough for a room, not enough for a meal and a way forward. But somehow, just enough to remind me of what she thought I was worth. $7 in my purse. That was the figure my life had boiled down to. Not the meals cooked, not the bills paid, not the years of sacrifice. Just 7 silent, wrinkled bills. And the worst part wasn't the money. It was that she let me go like I had never mattered. She didn't say goodbye because she didn't think she had to. Because in her mind, she had done enough, given enough, carried me long enough. But what she never understood is that you don't discard a mother like an expired receipt. You don't calculate the cost of love in bills and space. I didn't cry right away. I was past that. There's a stage beyond heartbreak where your body forgets how to react, where even your tears feel wasted. I sat still, letting the streetlights shine on my face like a cold kind of grace. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, I whispered to no one, God, if you still see me, please, do something. I didn't know it then, but heaven had already started moving. But even as I sat there, tired, humiliated, holding $7 and no direction, I still had something she could never take from me. I had breath, and that meant I still had a chance. The wind got colder after midnight. Not the kind that bites, but the kind that settles into your bones like it plans to stay a while. I shifted on the ledge behind the gas station, hugging my coat tighter, though it barely held any warmth. The crackers I bought earlier were long gone, and the bottle of water now sat empty beside me. A pit formed in my stomach, not just from hunger, but from the sudden realization that this wasn't temporary. This wasn't a bad day. This was the new beginning no one warned me about. I got up when my legs began to cramp and wandered toward the dimly lit main road. There was a diner across the street. Open 24 hours, its neon sign buzzed quietly in the dark like a small, stubborn heartbeat. I stood across from it for a long time, debating if it was worth it. Coffee would cost me something, but sitting outside all night might cost me more. I went in. The bell over the door gave a small chime. A few heads turned, but no one stared long enough to make me feel noticed. I slid into a booth near the back, choosing the seat closest to the heater. A waitress with tired eyes and a kind face came over. "Coffee?" she asked. I nodded. No cream, no sugar, just hot. It cost me $1.50. I handed her 2 singles and told her to keep the change. That left me with just over $4. But for that hour, That small cup was everything. It was warmth. It was dignity. It was a reason to sit still and not fall apart. I didn't drink it quickly. I let it sit in front of me, watching the steam rise and disappear, the way my life had vanished behind me only hours before. My hands wrapped around the cup like it could anchor me to something real, something safe. A man in the corner booth glanced my way, but I looked down, not in shame, but in quiet self-preservation. I didn't want pity. I didn't want questions. I just wanted to make it through the night. The waitress came back once to refill my cup. She didn't ask for more money, just gave me a soft smile like maybe she understood. Perhaps she saw the weariness in my eyes and recognized it from her own reflection. I wanted to thank her, but the words didn't come, so I just nodded. Time moved more slowly in that diner. I watched people come and go, a couple arguing quietly, a group of young people laughing like the world was still theirs. For a moment, I imagined I was one of them, belonging somewhere. But the coffee cooled, and reality always returns. When I finally stood up to leave, my legs felt heavier than before. But I left that place with more than I came with, not in my purse, but in my spirit. Because that night, I realized something. Even if no one else showed up for me, I could show up for myself. Morning light doesn't feel like hope when you've spent the night pretending not to cry. It feels like exposure. Like the world is peeling back the blanket of darkness that kept your shame hidden. I left the diner just after 6. The streets were quieter than I expected, but my thoughts were loud. I didn't have a destination, just a suitcase with squeaky wheels, and a name I had to remember to say with confidence. Because at that point, my name was the only thing I had left that hadn't been stripped from me. I walked for hours, past schools I never attended, shops I couldn't afford, and houses where I imagined people waking up to breakfast and belonging. I stopped at a small public restroom in a park and splashed cold water on my face. The mirror above the sink was cracked, and my reflection looked older than it had the day before. Tired eyes, wrinkled worry. But I stood tall and reminded myself, your name is Ruth. That still means something. A part of me expected things to fix themselves somehow. Like the moment I stepped out on my own, life would swing back in my favor. But it didn't. No one came running, no open arms, just one slow hour after another. I checked my phone every 2 hours, even though I knew no one would call. It was more habit than hope. By noon, I'd found a community shelter not far from the downtown bus station. They gave me a peanut butter sandwich and let me sit under a shady canopy. No questions, no judgment. Just tired people sharing the same kind of invisible pain. We were all stories no one had time to read. I met a woman named Doreen who said she'd been there for 6 months. She wore 2 coats, even though it was warm outside, and said it helped her feel safe. We didn't talk much, but she nodded at me like she knew the kind of silence I was carrying. That small gesture gave me strength I didn't know I still had. I learned quickly that eye contact can be dangerous when you look too desperate. That people will cross the street to avoid your story before you even have the chance to tell it. However, I also learned that kindness often resides in quiet places. In a free sandwich. In an unasked question. In a stranger's nod. That day, I didn't beg. I didn't crumble. I simply survived with no address, no money, no map. Just the strength to keep moving and the memory of a name that once meant something. Ruth. Not Mom, not Ma. Not the version of me who waited by the door for someone to check in. Just Ruth. A woman trying to rebuild herself with broken pieces and whispered prayers. And somehow, that was enough to make it to the next day. The day I bought the lottery ticket didn't feel special. There were no signs, no sudden gust of wind or glowing clouds or mysterious coincidences. Just hunger in my stomach, dust on my shoes, and another long walk with no real direction. I had spent most of the afternoon sitting outside the shelter, staring at the sidewalk like it could offer answers. When my legs started to cramp, I picked up my suitcase and wandered off, letting the rhythm of walking quiet the noise in my mind. I passed a small gas station tucked between a barber shop and a rundown laundromat. The kind of place you don't notice unless you need something cheap or quick. I didn't plan to stop, but my feet turned in without asking. Maybe it was the promise of cold air. Maybe it was the smell of something fried. Perhaps it was just the need to feel normal for a moment. Inside, the lights buzzed faintly, and the air smelled like stale coffee and rubber. I walked past the aisles, not looking for anything in particular. I only had a few dollars left, and even in my desperation, I was careful. Careful with my money. Careful with my face. Careful with my dignity. I picked up a pack of gum, then put it back. Reached for a bottle of juice, then remembered water was free if I asked nicely. That's when I saw it. The sign above the counter, in bold and capitalized, reads Lotto Jackpot, $800,000. The number meant nothing to me. Not really. It was just too far, too big, too impossible. But something in me paused, maybe because I had nothing left to lose. Maybe because I'd reached the kind of tired that makes you try things you don't believe in anymore. I approached the counter and asked for one quick pick ticket. The cashier looked at me, then down at my worn coat and dusty shoes. He didn't say anything, just handed it over. I gave him $2 and kept the change. The ticket felt like nothing in my hand. A piece of paper with random numbers on it. Worthless. Silly. Desperate. But I folded it carefully and tucked it into the zipper pocket of my suitcase. I didn't smile. I didn't dream. I didn't let myself imagine what I would do with the money if the numbers matched. That kind of hope had become dangerous. I had trained myself not to reach too far, not to want too much. Disappointment hurts more when it follows a period of hope. So I left the store the same way I entered it, quiet, unnoticed, and still unsure of where I was going next. That night, I didn't think about the ticket. I didn't even remember it. It slept quietly in my suitcase, surrounded by thrift store shirts and folded prayers. But in that moment, without realizing it, I had purchased more than a lottery slip. I had purchased a seed. And seeds don't look like much at first. They sit in the dark, buried and forgotten, until the right day comes. I didn't know it yet, but mine was coming. The next morning, I joined the line at the soup kitchen. It was longer than usual, the kind of long that humbles even the proudest hearts. I stood there with my suitcase behind me like a shadow, and my hands tucked into my sleeves to keep warm. The air smelled of cabbage, bread, and the kind of quiet desperation no one wants to admit. I didn't speak to anyone. I just waited, like everyone else, for something warm to hold on to, even if it was only a bowl of soup and half a sandwich. Inside, the noise was a low hum. Plastic trays clattering, murmured thank yous, spoons scraping against bowls. I found a corner seat by the wall and stared at my food as though eating it too fast might make the moment disappear. I wasn't hungry anymore, not really. Hunger had turned into something else. Numbness, maybe. I took slow bites, more out of habit than need. I tried to keep my eyes low so I wouldn't lock eyes with anyone and risk starting a conversation I wasn't strong enough to finish. She sat across from me without asking. At first, I thought she was just another volunteer on a break. She wore a simple sweater and had soft gray curls tucked under a head wrap. Her hands looked weathered, like life had made her earn every wrinkle. She didn't ask my name, didn't comment on how I looked. She just sat, as though we already knew each other, and silence was our native language. After a while, she nodded toward my suitcase. "You walking far?" Her voice was gentle, but not pitying. It held the kind of authority only life can give. A woman who'd seen pain, walked through it, and lived to speak kindly on the other side. "Just around," I said, the way you say when you don't want to explain too much. She didn't push, just reached into her own bag and pulled out a tattered old radio, one of those small handheld ones with a speaker that crackles. She turned the dial slowly, adjusting until a soft voice filled the room. It was a man announcing the lottery numbers from the previous night. I recognized the voice, but barely registered what he was saying. I hadn't even thought about the ticket since I bought it. It had disappeared into the background noise of survival. Then she looked at me, not with urgency, but with quiet curiosity. "You play?" she asked. I nodded. "Once." She smiled slightly. "Well, you never know." I reached down and unzipped the small pocket in my suitcase, more out of politeness than belief. I unfolded the ticket and held it loosely in my hand, listening to the numbers being called. One by one. The first number matched. So did the second. Then the third. She noticed before I did. "Read that again," she whispered. I did. And when the last number matched, the spoon slipped from my hand and hit the tray with a sharp clang. She smiled again. "I told you," she said softly. "You never know." I stared down at the ticket in disbelief. I had walked in for soup, but I was about to walk out with something that would change everything. I sat there frozen. The room didn't spin, but everything else inside me did. My hands trembled around that little slip of paper, as though it had suddenly grown heavy with the weight of a future I hadn't dared to imagine. The numbers on the ticket weren't just numbers anymore. They were a sentence, a shift, a sound that cracked through the silence of every hard night I'd endured. I stared down at it, then looked up at the old radio, then back again. I read it 3 more times, lips barely moving, afraid I'd somehow misread it, afraid it would vanish if I looked too long. Across from me, the woman from the soup kitchen just kept smiling like she'd seen this kind of thing before, like she knew all along what I was about to discover. "You should tell someone," she said, as if that were an easy thing to do. But who do you tell when you're sitting in a soup kitchen with dirt on your sleeves and disbelief in your throat? I rose slowly, legs stiff from sitting, knees weak from something I couldn't name. I didn't feel lucky. I felt confused, unsteady, like someone had moved the floor beneath me. I walked to the front of the room, where a younger volunteer stood wiping down a table. "Excuse me," I said, voice barely louder than a breath. "Do you have access to the lottery numbers from last night?" He pulled out his phone without question, scrolled quickly, then turned the screen toward me. I leaned in, holding my breath, reading the numbers again. They matched. All of them. He looked from his phone to the ticket in my hand, then back again. His brows lifted. "Ma'am," he said, blinking hard. "You just won." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. "You just won," he repeated, his voice a little louder this time, more certain, like saying it twice would make it real. But I couldn't process it. My brain stalled. My body didn't move. I'd spent so long not expecting anything good that even good news felt like a threat. I waited for someone to tell me it was expired, misprinted, or invalid. I waited for the ground to give out. But no one came to take it from me. No one told me I didn't deserve it. And somehow, that scared me more than if they had. The woman from earlier walked past as I stood there, still clutching the ticket like it might disappear. She touched my arm lightly and said, "Don't look so shocked, baby. Sometimes, after all the storms, God still sends a harvest." I didn't respond. I just nodded. And I felt the first tear slide down my cheek. Not out of joy, not even out of relief, but out of something deeper. a kind of release. The soundless cry of a woman who had learned how to carry pain quietly, now standing at the edge of something she had never seen coming. I thought it was a cruel joke, but it wasn't. It was the door I never thought would open, and somehow, it had opened for me. The moment the words sank in, "You just won," something in me began to unravel. Not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, like a rope that had been pulled too tight for too long, it finally gave way. I nodded at the young man, tucked the ticket gently back into my pocket, and murmured something about needing a minute. I don't even remember if he answered me. My legs carried me to the far end of the building, where the restroom was hidden behind a dented door and a flickering light above it. The bathroom was empty. Cold tile, dim mirror, silence humming in the corners. I stepped into the last stall, closed the door behind me, and sat down, fully clothed, hands folded in my lap, ticket still inside my coat. And then I broke. Not the dramatic kind of crying, not the kind that comes with sobs and rocking back and forth. No, this was something else. Deeper. Older. My shoulders shook in slow, quiet waves as hot tears slipped down my face and soaked into my collar. I covered my mouth with one hand, not because anyone could hear me, but because I didn't know how to contain what was coming out of me. For 25 minutes, I cried for everything I had buried just to survive. I cried for the night my daughter looked through me like I didn't matter. I cried for every morning I woke up with no address, no plan, and no one waiting on the other end of a phone call. I cried for the woman I used to be, and the one I was becoming now, without knowing what that would cost. There was no joy in the beginning of those tears, only exhaustion. The kind of weariness you can't explain unless you've lived long enough to be disappointed by the people you gave your life to. The kind of pain that has no words, just wait. But somewhere in the middle of it, maybe in the 15th minute, maybe the 20th, I felt something shift. Not around me, inside me. It was as if God himself had stepped into that stall, pulled up a seat beside me and whispered, "I saw it all. Every night, every step, every time you felt invisible." And suddenly, the tears began to change. They softened. They came slower, less frantic, more sacred. As if I were being washed, as if years of silent heartbreak were finally being allowed to speak. I didn't come out until my breathing calmed. My hands stopped shaking, and the woman staring back at me in the cracked mirror didn't look lost anymore. Just tired, but not hopeless. I splashed cold water on my face, pressed a paper towel against my cheeks, and fixed my coat. Then I walked out of that bathroom not like someone who had just won the lottery, but like someone who had just come back to life. Sometimes healing doesn't happen in grand moments. Sometimes it starts in a bathroom stall, with nothing but silence, tears, and the presence of God. No one prepares you for the moment your life changes, not when you've already accepted that it never would. I didn't sleep that night. I held the ticket close to me like it might vanish if I loosened my grip. I read the numbers again and again, and each time they matched, my breath caught just like it did the first time. Even in the dark, even in silence, I didn't feel alone. I felt watched, protected. Like heaven had placed something in my hands I hadn't even dared to pray for. The next morning, I walked, didn't run, didn't rush, to the lottery office. I had to borrow a pen from the security guard outside just to fill out the back of the ticket. My hands shook the entire time, not from fear, but from disbelief. It felt like I was writing my name on a new life and saying goodbye to every version of me that had suffered in silence. Inside, the air was sterile and cool, and everything had a faint scent of paper and ink. I waited on a gray plastic chair while a woman behind glass examined the ticket, as if it were just another day. For me, it wasn't just paper, It was breath. It was food. It was finally being seen. After a few checks and questions, she looked up and smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, but enough to tell me everything was real. "Congratulations," she said. "You're officially a winner." Winner. I hadn't heard that word used on me in decades. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just nodded slowly, quietly. Because some kinds of joy are too deep for sound, they gave me instructions, walked me through the details, and told me the amount I'd be receiving after taxes. It was still more than I'd ever seen in my life. I signed documents with hands that had once scrubbed hotel floors, hands that had packed my daughter's lunches, hands that had been empty just days ago. I left that building with a folder in my bag, my name on a check, and no idea what would come next. I didn't go straight to a luxury store. I didn't buy a car. I didn't announce it to the world. I found a quiet motel on the edge of town, paid for 2 nights in cash, and for the first time in months, slept under a roof that wasn't a shelter or a borrowed porch. And I cried again, but not in despair. I cried because I had walked the valley, tasted the dirt, lost everything but my name. And now, I was walking into a future I hadn't been invited to, until now. Going from homeless to holding a fortune isn't just about money. It's about memory, about standing in the space between who you were and who you're becoming, and realizing that grace doesn't always arrive in stained glass and choirs. Sometimes it shows up on a folded ticket in a coat pocket. And it changes everything. The day the money cleared, I sat on the edge of a motel bed staring at the plain white walls like they held the answers. There was no celebration, no fireworks, no champagne. Just me, a folded piece of paper confirming the transfer, and the quiet hum of the old air conditioner rattling in the corner. I had won, yes, but what I wanted now wasn't noise. It was stillness, safety, something soft to land on that didn't come with conditions or expiration dates. Everyone thinks the first thing you do when you come into money is run toward the biggest thing you can find. A mansion, a car, and some loud declaration that screams, "Look at me now." But after you've been invisible long enough, you don't want to be seen. You just want to feel. So I didn't buy a mansion. I bought peace. I found a modest little apartment on the quiet side of town. Nothing flashy. Nothing that made you stop and stare. But it had a window that caught the morning sun and a front door I could lock with a key that was mine. The walls were pale blue. The kitchen had just enough room for a small table, and the bedroom had space for a dresser and a bed. Not a grand bed, not a king-size statement piece. Just something I could crawl into and know that no one could kick me out of it. I bought new sheets. That was the first real purchase. Crisp, white, clean. I ran my hands across them in the store and felt something rise in my throat. They smelled like new beginnings, like something no one else had touched before me. I carried them home in a plain shopping bag and made the bed myself that night, pressing down every corner like I was tucking in my own piece. There was no crowd to see it, no applause. But as I lay down and pulled those sheets over me, I exhaled in a way I hadn't in years. That soft cotton against my skin felt like a hug I didn't know I needed. A quiet reward for every night I'd slept sitting up, guarding a suitcase like it held my soul. I bought candles too, simple ones, vanilla, lavender, things that made the air feel gentle. I stocked my fridge with real food. I put a plant by the window and named it Grace. And every morning, I opened the blinds and watched the light pour in, as if God himself had remembered my address. I didn't want luxury. I wanted life to stop feeling like a punishment. And every detail in that tiny space, the clean sheets, the soft glow, the scent of something warm in the kitchen, told me I was safe now. Not flashy, not loud, just safe. Sometimes winning isn't about rising to the top. Sometimes it's about finally finding the floor beneath you, solid and still, and choosing to live on it quietly, with gratitude in your bones and peace on your pillow. It was a Tuesday morning when the incident occurred. Ordinary in every way. The kind of morning most people rush through without noticing. The sound of the kettle clicking off. The faint birdsong outside. The scent of toast rising from the kitchen. But for me, it was the kind of quiet that felt sacred. I had just made a cup of tea and was standing barefoot in my little apartment, staring out the window as sunlight stretched across the floor like a welcome mat from heaven. And without thinking, without forcing, without performing, I smiled. Not a polite smile. Not the kind you give to strangers out of habit or obligation. This one rose from somewhere deep, like it had been waiting its turn for years and finally had permission to show up. I didn't even realize it at first. It crept across my face slowly, gently, like my soul was testing the waters. And when I caught my reflection in the window, I saw a woman I hadn't seen in a long time. Not because I didn't recognize her face, but because I recognized the freedom behind her eyes. It's strange how grief can become your second skin. How, after a while, you start to believe that heaviness is your default setting. I had worn so many versions of survival, smiles that hid shame, nods that disguised fear, and silence that covered 1,000 unspoken heartbreaks. I'd spent years pretending to be okay, so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable around my broken pieces. But that morning, nothing was forced. The tea wasn't fancy. The day held no big plans. I hadn't won anything new. No more checks, no new surprises. Just me, my breath, my space, my quiet little apartment filled with light and the scent of peace. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled because I meant it. It didn't come from money. It didn't come from revenge. It didn't come from proving anyone wrong. It came from the simple joy of knowing I had survived. That, after everything, after the rejection, the humiliation, the cold nights on benches and bathroom stalls, I had found a soft place to land. My own place, my own warmth, my own life. I stood there for a long time, sipping tea and letting the smile linger, unbothered and unbent. It was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was full of small victories, sacred memories, and the deep, holy hush of restoration. No one saw it. No one needed to. That moment wasn't for the world. It was for me. And I knew then that something had changed, not around me, but within me. Because joy that isn't borrowed or bought, that's the kind that lasts. If you're still here, thank you. This part was the hardest to tell. The call came 2 weeks after the check cleared. I had just come back from the market, a paper bag full of groceries cradled in my arms, and a soft hymn humming from the radio. The apartment smelled like cinnamon and soap, and for the first time in years, it felt like my home. I was halfway through slicing apples for a pie I hadn't baked in decades when the phone rang. The number was familiar. Too familiar. I stood still for a moment, the knife resting on the cutting board, my breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. I hadn't heard from her since the day she turned her back and closed the door behind me. The same door I used to knock on with groceries in hand and aching feet, never expecting anything but a seat at her table. I picked up. Her voice was calm, almost sweet, like honey masking something bitter. "Hi, Mom," she said, like she hadn't erased me, like we'd spoken just yesterday. I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew too well. She talked for a while, asked how I was doing, said she'd been thinking about me, how she had just heard the news, how small towns always whisper louder than people realize. I listened quietly as she circled the point like a vulture waiting for the right moment to descend. Then she said it. "I know you probably have your hands full now with everything. she began, stretching the word as if trying to wrap it around her guilt. I was wondering if you might be able to help me out a little. Things have been tight. There it was. Not an apology. Not a single word about the day she sent me away with nothing but a suitcase and a bruised soul. No mention of the night I slept behind a gas station or the tears I buried in a soup kitchen bathroom. She didn't want reconciliation. She wanted a cut. I looked around my small, sunlit kitchen, the pie crust waiting to be filled, the kettle beginning to rattle, the plant by the window I'd named Grace, growing steadily and softly. I thought of the night I counted $7 in my purse and wondered how I'd make it to morning. And then I thought of the peace I'd built. Quiet, honest, earned. I'll think about it, I said, voice steady, not cold. I'm glad you called. But I wasn't. I hung up a few minutes later, politely, without anger. Because I'd already cried all the tears I had for her, I no longer needed her love to breathe. I no longer needed her presence to feel like a mother. What she didn't realize is that sometimes, when life gives you back everything you lost, it also gives you the clarity to see who really stood beside you in the dark. And she wasn't one of them. I didn't write a letter. I didn't include a note, or a verse, or a single word, just the money. 7 wrinkled, gently flattened dollar bills, sealed in a plain white envelope with no return address and no explanation. I stood at the counter in the post office for a long time before handing it over, my fingers pressing against the paper like they could transfer all the unspoken things I wasn't brave or bitter enough to say aloud. I had thought about what I'd do for weeks after the call. I replayed her voice in my mind more times than I care to admit. The way she said mom like it still meant something. The way she asked for help, not with humility, but with the quiet expectation of someone who never considered what it had cost me to survive. I wasn't angry anymore. That part of me had burned out on cold nights and empty benches. What I felt now was something quieter. Not vengeance, not pride, just resolve. The kind that comes when you've seen your own bones under the weight of heartbreak and decided you will never carry anyone again who chooses not to carry you. I didn't send her money because she needed it. I sent her what she thought I was worth. $7. The same amount I walked away with the day she told me to go. She'd probably stare at that envelope the same way I stared at her front door that day, waiting for more and waiting for an explanation, for an apology, for meaning. But this time, I didn't owe her any of those things, because sometimes silence says it better. I imagined her opening it, counting the bills slowly, confusion settling on her face like dust. I imagined her thinking back, trying to connect the dots, wondering why it wasn't more, why I didn't call, why I didn't write. But some debts aren't owed in money. Some are owed in memory. And if she remembered even a sliver of the pain she packed into that little black duffel by the door, she'd know. She'd know. I walked out of the post office into the afternoon sun, the wind soft against my face. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cold. I felt clean. Like something had been set down that I'd been dragging behind me for far too long. Some stories don't need to be retold. Some wounds don't need to be reopened. And there are messages best delivered without a single word. That envelope was mine. And it carried every ounce of closure I would never ask her to understand. Forgiveness doesn't always come with a warm embrace or a phone call full of tears. Sometimes it comes quietly, without announcement, in the stillness between who you were and who you've become. Mine came on a Thursday afternoon while folding laundry. A shirt she once complimented slipped through my hands, and without warning, her name drifted into my thoughts. Not with pain, but with a strange kind of peace. I stood there for a moment, holding that fabric like it was fragile, and I whispered something I hadn't planned to say. I forgive you. It didn't feel heroic. It didn't feel profound. It felt necessary because bitterness is a weight, a slow poison that settles into your soul and turns even your victories sour. And I had tasted enough sorrow. I wasn't going to let her keep a seat at the table of my joy, not when she had walked out of the room before the feast began. But forgiveness, as I've learned, isn't the same as forgetting. I still remember the way she looked through me, how her eyes skipped over my face like I was a stranger asking for too much. I remember the sound of the door clicking shut behind me, the way the world felt too big and too empty all at once. I remember sitting behind that gas station with crackers and a suitcase, wondering how a mother becomes disposable. I don't relive those moments to keep wounds open. I remember them so I never lose sight of what I survived. Some people think forgiveness is about setting the other person free. Maybe it is. But for me, it was about setting myself free. I didn't want her absence to echo through every room I entered. I didn't want her voice, or the lack of it, to determine my worth. So I forgave her. Fully. Deeply. But I kept the lessons. The way you keep burn marks even after the fire's out. She never apologized. I stopped expecting one. You can't pull remorse from someone who's convinced they did nothing wrong. And you can't build reconciliation on silence. I let that dream go, gently, like you let go of someone who doesn't know they were holding you hostage. But I didn't let go of myself. I still protect the healed places. I still measure people by how they handle my vulnerability. I still remember that love isn't love when it leaves you on the curb with no shelter and no goodbye. So yes, I forgave her. But when I lay my head down at night on clean sheets, in a home built from nothing but grace and grit, I don't do it because she came back. I do it because I did. And every day I wake up in peace is proof that forgiveness was never meant for her. It was the door I had to walk through to reach freedom. There's a strange quiet that settles in after the chaos ends. After the paperwork is signed, the keys are handed over, and the first meals are cooked in silence. Not because no one's around, but because you finally made peace with your own company. I had money now. I had safety, privacy, softness. But the real miracle wasn't what was in my bank account. It was who I started discovering inside me when the noise stopped. One morning, I walked into a bookstore. Not to buy anything expensive, just to linger. The scent of paper and old shelves calmed me in a way nothing else could. I picked up a used novel for $3 and sat by the window, reading and sipping coffee from a chipped cup that tasted like peace. Nobody knew me there. Nobody stared. Nobody remembered the woman who had once eaten crackers on a bench behind a gas station. I started doing things I hadn't done in years, things money couldn't buy. I took walks at dawn, sat in parks just to listen to the birds. I smiled at strangers without shrinking. I even went to the movies alone and didn't feel embarrassed. I began to reclaim the parts of me that had been buried beneath motherhood, beneath struggle, beneath survival. The Ruth who used to hum while folding laundry. The Ruth who read poetry out loud when no one was listening. The Ruth who laughed, not to make others comfortable, but because something genuinely delighted her. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. Not to my daughter, not to the world, not even to myself. I had nothing left to prove, and everything left to explore. There was no deadline on my healing, no script to follow. Just me, learning how to live slowly again. Learning how to sit quietly and not mistake it for loneliness. I had chased peace for so long, I didn't recognize it at first when it came and sat next to me like an old friend. In the afternoons, I started journaling. Just a few lines each day. Not because I wanted to write a book or tell my story to strangers, but because I needed to remind myself that I was still here. That I still had thoughts, dreams, and a voice. I wrote about sunsets, forgiveness, the little girl I used to be, and the woman I'd become. No filters, no edits, just the truth. I thought winning the lottery would give me back everything I lost. But it didn't. It gave me the space to find what I'd forgotten. Myself. Not the version shaped by pain or rejection or obligation, but the quiet, steady version who doesn't need permission to exist, who smiles without faking it, who laughs without waiting for approval, who rests. And in that resting, in that deep, sacred stillness, I found something more valuable than money. I found myself. My name is Ruth, and I'm not who I was. I used to whisper that name like it was something fragile, something I had to protect from the weight of what the world had done to me. There was a time I said it with shame, when my reflection looked tired, when my hands felt empty, when I believed that being discarded by the one you loved most meant you were no longer worth holding on to. I wore that name like a bruise, like a scar I didn't ask for. But not anymore. Now, when I say it, it sits firm in my chest. Ruth. A name carried by a woman in scripture who followed faith into fields that didn't belong to her, who gleaned from the corners and found favor in unexpected places. I didn't understand that connection before, but now I do. Because I, too, have walked behind others, picking up pieces of my life wherever I could find them. I, too, have been the outsider. The one overlooked. The one who didn't belong until grace said otherwise. I am not the same woman who walked away from her daughter's front door with a packed bag and a forced goodbye. I am not the woman who counted her last dollars on a bench, heart cracked in too many places to hold hope. That woman was weary. That woman was in survival mode. She did what she had to do, and I honor her for it. But I've outgrown her. Pain shaped me, yes, but it didn't finish me. Now, I speak softer, but I stand taller. Now, I rest without guilt. Now, I walk into rooms without shrinking. Healing didn't come all at once. It came in layers. It came in the form of tea, clean sheets, and journals filled with scribbled prayers. It came in the steady rhythm of breathing without fear, of laughing without watching the door, of waking up and knowing I didn't owe anyone an explanation for my joy. I used to think starting over meant losing everything. But starting over taught me that the best parts of me were never gone. They were just buried under obligation, silence, and someone else's version of who I was supposed to be. Now I live gently but fully. I no longer need loud moments to feel alive. I find God in the quiet things, the kettle on the stove, the softness of warm laundry, the breeze through an open window. These aren't small moments. They're sacred. So if you ever see me in the market or walking down the street, smiling for no reason, understand this. You're looking at a woman who lost everything: home, family, dignity, and still found herself. My name is Ruth. And the woman you're seeing now? She's been rebuilt by fire, softened by grace, and made whole by the kind of love that doesn't have to be earned. I'm not who I was, and thank God for that. There's a certain kind of freedom that only comes after everything you thought you needed is stripped away. It doesn't come quickly. It doesn't come clean. It comes in pieces, like a wall crumbling brick by brick until suddenly you're standing in the open, barefoot and exposed, but no longer trapped. I didn't ask to lose everything. I didn't wake up one day wishing to be tossed out like a burden. But somewhere in the wreckage, somewhere between the sleepless nights and whispered prayers, something inside me broke loose. And it refused to go back to who I used to be. Before the fall, I held on too tightly. To people, to expectations, to routines that made me feel needed, even when they left me empty. I mistook being useful for being loved. I gave until there was nothing left, thinking that kind of sacrifice would be enough to keep me close to the ones I raised. But love that must be earned never truly holds. It only drains. When I walked out of that house, suitcase in hand, I thought I was losing the last bit of myself. I didn't realize it was the beginning of a shedding, an unraveling of everything false, everything forced. At first, it felt like death, but now I see it for what it really was: birth. In losing the roof over my head, I found shelter in God's presence like never before. In losing the approval of the one I loved, I found the courage to approve of myself. In losing the life I clung to, I discovered the life that was waiting quietly beneath all the noise. Freedom didn't come with the money. The check didn't heal my heart. It only gave me a cushion to land on while I learned how to live differently. The real freedom came when I stopped trying to be everything for everyone. When I let go of the need to explain myself. When I understood that closure doesn't always arrive wrapped in apologies or reconciliation. Sometimes, it comes as peace with unanswered questions. I used to define myself by what I had: a role, a routine, a place at someone else's table. Now, I define myself by what I carry: wisdom, grace, stillness, discernment. These are things that can't be stolen, sold, or thrown out with the trash. These are things I earned in the wilderness. So yes, I lost everything that once made me feel secure. But I gained something greater. I gained my voice. I gained still mornings and unshakable quiet. I gained the ability to sit with myself and not feel empty. I gained truth, uncomfortable, sacred, and finally mine. Some people never experience this kind of freedom because they're too afraid to let go. I didn't choose to let go. Life took everything from me. And in return, God gave me myself. But if I could go back and sit beside the woman I used to be, the one who walked away with a suitcase and a broken heart, there are a few things I would say. Not to fix it. Not to rush the healing. But to remind her that even the discarded still carry worth. I would tell her to breathe. Not the shallow kind we do when we're trying to hold it together, but the kind that reaches deep into your belly and reminds your body that you are still alive. Still here. Still worthy of the air you take in, even when someone you loved made you feel like you were in the way. Especially then. I would tell her she's not crazy for replaying the moment over and over, trying to figure out what she could have done differently. That loop in your mind, the words you wish you said, the signs you wish you caught, is just grief in disguise. You're grieving the version of love you thought you had. And it's okay. Grief is proof that you gave something real. I would tell her that being discarded doesn't mean you're defective. It doesn't mean you were too much or not enough. Sometimes people walk away because they're too small to carry the weight of your value. And rather than admit that, they'll make it your fault. Don't let that lie live inside you. I would tell her the most dangerous thing she can do now is build her identity around what she lost. That kind of pain will try to rewrite who you are, convince you that love is earned through silence, or that being needed is the same as being loved. But that's not true. You are not what they left behind. You are what you choose to pick up from here. I would tell her that healing is not loud. It doesn't always look like success, revenge, or a glowing appearance on social media. Sometimes healing looks like drinking tea in silence and not feeling lonely. Like folding laundry and humming again. Like saying no without guilt. Like waking up and realizing you didn't think about them today, and then smiling because that means something. I would tell her not to rush. Not into the arms of another. Not into distractions. Not into pretending she's fine. Let the ache teach you something. Let it draw out the wisdom you didn't know was in you. Because when you've been broken and rebuilt, there's a stillness in your soul that cannot be shaken. I would tell her she's allowed to protect her peace, even from the people she once lived for. I would say to her that starting over isn't shameful, it's holy, and that God has a way of writing beauty into the chapters we thought were over. not always by restoring what was lost, but by revealing what was never meant to stay. And last, I'd tell her to say her name out loud, to speak it like a promise, like a vow, like something sacred, because no matter who left, no matter what broke her name, still holds power. And that's where the rebuilding begins. I didn't write this to get pity. I wrote it because I know there's someone out there sitting on a bench like I once did, counting what little they have left: money, strength, dignity, and wondering if God still sees them. I'm living proof that He does. Life unraveled me, piece by piece, but grace gathered every thread, not to return me to who I was, but to shape me into someone stronger, softer, and far more free. I lost what I thought I couldn't live without, and found the version of me I never knew existed. This isn't just a story about money, it's a story about mercy, about becoming whole in the quiet, about rising without needing to announce it. I don't live in a mansion. I don't flaunt what I've been given. But every morning I wake up in peace. I call it wealth. So if you've been left, forgotten, thrown out like you were nothing, hear me. You are not nothing. You are becoming. And sometimes, the most significant breakthrough comes after the goodbye. This story may have ended, but the message lingers. For more raw and real moments like this, click the left and subscribe to walk alongside more women as they find their strength. Healing takes time, but it's possible.